A warm welcome to everyone here. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Resi. I lead design and program readiness for study program in Indonesia. Our topic today is one that I've been thinking about for a long time in a way that keeps challenging me. So, in education, we often talk about motivation as if it's a black box. We focus on the outcomes that we want to see. So, for example, students who are engaged, curious, and eager to learn, but we don't always unpack what's really driving those behaviors and what conditions needs to be established. So at STIR, we've been working in the area of motivation for more than a decade. And one thing we've learned is that motivation isn't simply something that people have or do not have. It's shaped by the environments we create and the mental processes we help to build. So in other words, it's not just an internal attitude, it's something we can intentionally design for. So there are so many things that we haven't yet understood, and we're trying to explore all of them, not all of them, but some of them today in the midst of motivation webinar. So a warm welcome to everyone again. Now, as we are thinking about the topic of myths of motivation, you might wonder that some of these myths may contain a small grain of truth or not. But so we'll see. That's what makes this conversation interesting. So as we'll spend some time together today, we'll do a bit of myth busting or some myth reclaiming as we unpack what really drives motivation and what evidence actually tells us. So with that, I will hand over to Jane to introduce our panelists and guide our conversation. Over to you, Jane. Sorry, Jane, if you can unmute yourself. Sorry, Jane.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Resi, for setting the stage. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to all joining us from the different parts of the world. My name is Jane Sebuyungo, the Associate Head of Design and Program Readiness at STAR Education in Uganda. I'll be moderating today's discussion on myths of motivation. We are delighted to have such a diverse audience of funders, stakeholders, experts, NGO, thought leaders coming across the world to join us today on this webinar. A warm welcome to everyone. We are about to open the black box of motivation. Is it just about money, freedom, or asking people what they want? We will see what unfolds. Please feel free to share your reflections and questions in the chat throughout the session. We'll bring those thoughts back to us and reflect on them during the key moments in the webinar. Let me briefly introduce our distinguished panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, we have Christin McConnell. He's the champion of structured learning and peer support. He's Chief of Education, UNICEF Ghana, championed, and he's leading education and skills programming alongside national advocacy and government partnership. With more than 20 years experience advancing education systems globally, she has held senior roles with Global Partnership for Education, the World Bank, USAID, and the US Peace Corps. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Christin. Next on the panel, we also have Jeff Wetzler. He is the advocate for autonomy, but with a sharp eye on scaffolding needed. He is co-founder of Transcend, where he supports communities for designing extraordinary learning environments, and now leads Transcend Labs, incubating new ventures. Previously, he's been Chief Learning Officer at Teach for America. He has also worked as a strategy consultant at Monitor Group. Jeff is co-author of Extraordinary Learning for All and author of Ask. Ladies and gentlemen, we have Jeff on this webinar. Next, the panelists, we have amazing Kate Rinehart-Smit. She is the researcher who dares to ask if passion is sometimes oversold. She is the impact lead at TAL Africa. She's a behavior scientist based in Cape Town, specializing in strengthening education programs across sub-Saharan Africa. Kate is a behavioral science and evidence specialist. She was formerly with Ideas 42. She's now impact lead at TAL Africa, driving continuous improvement and stronger learning outcomes at scale. Ladies and gentlemen, we have Kate on the webinar. Lastly, we have our own Thomas Jobin. He's the Associate Director of Monitoring and Evaluation at STAR Education and a development economist with over 13 years experience supporting large-scale education and skills programs through evidence and learning. Here is our format that we will work today. We will explore 3 widely held beliefs or myths about motivation. Each myth will be unpacked by one of our speakers, followed by Jobin sharing STAR's perspective and evidence. We will then open the floor for reflections from other panelists and questions from the audience. Please remember to drop your questions in the chat. Let's make this as interactive as possible. It's not a lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like us to move to unpacking our first myth. It is about teachers will only be motivated if you pay them more. Christin, may I invite you to share your thoughts on this?
Thank you so much, Jane. It's an honor to be here today, and good afternoon from Accra. So as Jane just mentioned, I'm here today in this segment to help debunk this myth that teacher motivation only increases if you pay teachers more. So let me maybe be clear from the outset. Of course, pay matters, right? We all want to be compensated for our work. And I don't think teachers are paid enough. That is true in many countries, including Ghana, where I live and work. But I also think we need to think about the current education financing landscape, right? And that right now, significant amounts of resources go into teacher compensation. So in Ghana, for example, 88% of our Ministry of Education's basic education budget already covers teacher compensation. So that's little percentage left to go towards goods and services and other quality inputs that we know will also help improve teaching and learning conditions. So under those current financial constraints, in many countries, it's going to be challenging to kind of get the Ministry of Finance to expand that budget line further. Nevertheless, when we're talking about teacher motivation, I think the real question isn't whether pay matters, it's whether pay alone, increasing pay alone, can help overcome some of the daily constraints that teachers face and lead to increased motivation. So for me, it's easy to kind of imagine a simple linear relationship between pay and motivation, where you'd have an increase of pay would lead to an increase in motivation. But we know that the reality is far more complex than that. Motivation is shaped by both extrinsic factors like salaries and working conditions, and intrinsic factors such as professional pride, autonomy, and the overall satisfaction of seeing students learn. I think many of these we're going to get into more details in this webinar today. And in Ghana, like many places, teachers are experiencing both of those types of factors at the same time. So in Ghana, with funding from the UK government, last year, UNICEF Ghana, we worked with STAR Education to better understand teacher motivation here, really unpacking kind of what constrains it, what supports it, and what policy and programmatic levers already exist in that topic of teacher motivation. In that research, when teachers talked about their main motivational constraints, increasing salaries certainly did come up, but it was only one part of a much longer list. So teachers also raised issues around kind of delays in funding reaching schools, a lack of teaching and learning materials, poor school infrastructure, especially things like wash facilities often came up, limited teacher recognition and feedback, staffing shortages in deprived schools, and overall kind of very limited autonomy at the school level. So when I think about teacher motivation, what stands out to me is that these constraints compound one another. So even if you're able to somehow do a significant salary increase, if you don't address these other issues, it's unlikely to lead to meaningful or kind of sustainable improvements in teacher motivation. So I saw this very clearly. About 4 weeks ago, I was visiting a remote primary school in the Volta region of Ghana. The school had 8 grade levels, so started at kindergarten 1 through primary 6, but just 3 early professional teachers running multi-grade classrooms and trying to do the best they could in this very resource-constrained environment. But I loved talking with these teachers. They were all very committed. They spoke with big smiles on their faces and pride about the students where they were able to see learning improvements. And I was very impressed of how they talked about how they spend their evenings and weekends actively upgrading their own qualifications, right? They were always working on what other additional coursework they could take to improve their qualifications. And so when we listened to them talk for almost 2 hours, their biggest struggles that they mentioned had little to do with pay, right? They felt very isolated in the community. The head teacher, for example, she didn't even speak the local language of the community. There was no network at the school, so they had to climb a nearby hill just to communicate with anybody else, or especially even their district office, about any challenges they faced. There were no toilet facilities for themselves as teachers or even the learners at the school. And when they wanted to leave the village, just given geographical constraints and Lake Volta nearby, like the transport costs to the regional capital were quite high. So I would say, like, at that school, I didn't say teachers were teachers were very much motivated, but they were also really constrained. So one thing in Ghana, I think that's being talked about a lot right recently is there's been an announcement about a 20% hardship allowance for teachers in deprived schools. So I think specifically of that particular school. So if that policy is implemented, right, I can see improvements happening to the school. I could see those 3 teachers having more support, right? Hopefully there's not just 3 teachers anymore, but that would help motivate, 5 or 6 others to join their school. That would overall improve their well-being and the work that they do. But I think also to manage expectations when I think about that hardship allowance, which I very much support, I'm not necessarily positive it would lead to a major shift in motivation overall, unless it's paired with other improvements on things exactly from that list I just talked about. So things related to working conditions and professional support and other overall holistic package to support teachers. So maybe in closing, I'll say, I think the lesson here is not that pay doesn't matter. It certainly does matter. But if we want motivated teachers, we need to look also beyond salaries and ask whether our systems overall are helping those teachers teach effectively, with dignity and a sense of purpose. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine, for those very thoughtful insights. We completely resonate with what you're sharing, and especially the experience you had when you visited those schools. It completely matches with even what we experience when we go to the ground, not just in Ghana, but also in other African countries or even Indonesia, where we work and have a program. So just to bring some more insights from our own learning here, Christine, we conducted an impact evaluation of our program in Uganda. And what we found was continuous learning, structured training, and collaborative peer support. They were key drivers of job satisfaction, even though, as you rightly pointed out when you started off, even though financial security still remains a big factor. And of course, we were fortunate enough to collaborate with UNICEF in our study in Ghana, and we found similar insights. So from all this, what we are learning is that it appears that while salary and financial incentives can get teachers into the classrooms, and probably it can retain them as well. However, there may be these other bunch, of factors that you rightly pointed out that may influence teaching quality itself. So, to be able to achieve learning outcomes for students, we do need teachers. We do need to retain them. Classrooms need to be, full, but the quality of teaching itself may be driven by these other factors, and they are very critical in driving these outcomes. So, if you're okay with it, I would just like to ask you a very brief follow-up question based on what you shared. So you listed, several drivers that, in your experience, also you felt that teachers valued in terms of non-monetary incentives. Among all of them, which would be, I know there's no single lever, but which ones could we prioritize if we were to, which may boost motivation in months and not in years? So if we were to choose, what would they be and why?
Thanks so much. Great question. I think what comes first to mind for me is about teacher professional development, mainly because I think this is a little bit of a low-hanging fruit, and it's something that Ghana does quite well already, right? So we have a continuous professional development system, right? Teachers are motivated to take those courses. I think this was even part of our research together with STIR about taking these professional development courses, right, can help boost your step in grade and help you, I think, get more pay and get more recognition. But I think doing this research together has made me better think about, are those actual, basically, can we do an audit of those teacher professional development courses to really tie in from a teacher motivation perspective? So if we are, doing a course, for example, on, teaching strategies for multi-grade classrooms, just really making sure, well, actually, I want to make sure that's a professional development course, because one of the things I think we need to make sure that these courses are extremely relevant and contextualized to the true challenges those teachers are facing in the classroom. Otherwise, it's a checkbox activity to say, okay, I took this course on this, but that really doesn't apply to me and my context here. So I think overall, from a teacher motivation landscape, making sure that kind of the menu of courses available for teachers are actually relatable to them. And I think also us following up and doing proper measurement to make sure those courses were impactful and led to kind of teacher behavioral change and motivation there on the ground. So that first comes to mind to me of maybe tackling the teacher professional development angle already, because we have a strong system in place in Ghana. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christin. That's a really valuable insight. Thank you so much. Back to you, Jane.
Thank you very much. Wonderful to hear from Christin and Jobin. Thank you so much for grounding this with evidence. We've had Christin drop a very important line. It's not about pay that matters, but does increasing pay alone lead to motivation? And based on the discussion and evidence from Jobin, is clearly coming out that it's a variety of menu that supports motivation, both intrinsic, complemented by conditions. Pride, autonomy is very key from the Ghana's experience. And we are hearing that while salaries and financial incentives can get teachers to the classroom, the quality of teaching is driven by other factors. Ladies and gentlemen, would love to hear what questions are coming out from the chat. Have we got some responses in the chat. Well, I've not yet seen a response in the chat, and I encourage participants to drop their comments in the chat so that we get this conversation engaging. Ladies and gentlemen, would love to go on to the next panelist, and we would love to explore more the second myth. Our second myth is the more freedom we give people, the more motivated they will be. Jeff, over to you. What does this mean in your experience?
Thank you, Jane, and thank you all for inviting me to join. I think my answer in some ways will feel very thematically similar to what Christine said, which is that this factor matters, but not alone and not in isolation. So I want to talk about what else needs to go along with freedom, and why freedom alone can be even problematic to maximize. But I also want to maybe complicate the question of educators, in the sense that not all educators are in the same place in their development. Not all educators have the same desire or readiness for autonomy while they're growing. And even the idea of what is an educator is a product of design that I think we can also be taking a look at as well. So we'll come back to those pieces. But I think that the myth is not, or the mistake is not valuing autonomy as a factor. Autonomy can play a really important role. It's treating autonomy, or frankly any factor, as a silver bullet in its own right. So autonomy can play a very important role when other conditions alongside it exist. So for example, when educators truly know what success looks like, when they feel capable and are capable of achieving that success, when they feel part of something larger than themselves, such as a community of other educators. In the context of those other factors, autonomy can absolutely play a role. But if we imagine just maximizing autonomy at at the cost of everything else, you can imagine all kinds of things going wrong. Things like curriculum drift, like every teacher with all of their autonomy teaching something different, and students experiencing incoherence across different parts of their experience or different time. Teachers reinventing things nightly because they have the freedom to just do that. Teachers completely burning themselves out because the cognitive load shifts from the system to them, and so on. They wouldn't be necessarily able to collaborate or compare work because they're all off doing their own thing, or they might even just be unclear about what's going on if everyone is doing something completely different. And so if we were only giving as much freedom as possible in the absence of those other factors, it could actually be problematic. That being said, if in the context of those other factors, when teachers have shared learning goals and shared standards, but have the autonomy to either design or adapt lessons based on what they know about their students, when there's common assessments, but there's more flexibility in instructional strategies, when there's agreed upon outcomes, but teachers can decide what kinds of projects they want to be building in, when they know the destination and they have the tools to get there, and then they can exercise their judgment on how to get there, that can create a level of agency and ownership that is not only good for teacher motivation, but also we have found can translate into student motivation as well. Because when teachers have flexibility, that can also allow them to give students more flexibility. So just to come back to what I was saying about complicating this idea of what is an educator, two things I want to say. One is, I don't think we can just say educators and mean the same thing for every single human being that is an educator. There are brand new educators who are novice, who I think crave support and structure and the ability to be successful. And on the other extreme, they're absolutely veteran educators, and who have the ability to responsibly exercise more autonomy and even help other educators exercise more autonomy. And we have seen models where more experienced and successful educators do have the freedom that is greater than new educators to support those educators and to do other kinds of things, and that can be successful. But the other piece, just to complicate a little bit, is this idea of what is an educator, because I think most educators are still operating in a industrial paradigm of school that typically does constrain their autonomy in ways that is often problematic and does not tap into um, their creativity and their expertise and their dedication and their love for students. And this idea that we have one teacher in a box with anywhere from 30 to 100 or 200 students being told this is what you have to teach, this is the curriculum, that it doesn't have to be that way. There are many other ways to design what learning can be, and that is a design question that has to live beyond the classroom. It has to live at the school level and sometimes at the system level as well. But if we really want to bring in this question of how do we tap into what educators can really do and give them appropriate levels of freedom and autonomy in the context of other factors, I think the deeper question to ask is why are we designing that role in the way that we are in the first place? So I'll pause there.
Thank you, Jeff. I think that's really insightful, and I really like the way you highlighted the real tension there. This is exactly what we witness when we work through our programs in Uganda and Indonesia. We do feel that autonomy can be absolutely powerful driver of motivation. However, as you rightly pointed out, there are support mechanisms, or there is a context in which it may work and it may not. To go back to the idea that you shared, I'd just like to point out something specific and bring in what we have been learning from our program in Uganda and Indonesia. So one of the insights that really intrigued us was that teachers, in a study that we conducted to evaluate impact of our program, we found that teachers did report autonomy. They reported that leadership gives them choices in how they work. However, now here comes the caveat that even you highlighted. They mentioned that they still struggle to incorporate feedback into their practice. So even though there is autonomy in a sense of what it looks like, in terms of operationalizing it, but then it does not translate into classroom practices. And we kind of tried to dig deeper to find out why this might be, and it turned out that teachers need more support. So even though what you highlighted that absolute autonomy could actually turn into chaos as well, the teachers keep designing whatever they want to, and there's no coherence. There could be another reason why it may not work, which is they just don't have the support to operationalize the feedback or the autonomy that they have, which is what you were trying to frame as well. So we also found that consultation forums can feel empowering. So there can be teachers who are part of these forums, but if these forums are not meaningfully engaging teachers, then it could just turn out to be a tokenistic or a top-down hierarchical mechanism. So fully agree with what you shared, Jeff, and therefore that leads me to this question that I want to maybe seek your thoughts on. You mentioned that you talked about the scaffolding around autonomy that might be contextual and may be required for autonomy to be successful or to be effective. What, according to you, this scaffolding may look like? I know that's a like it would have a lot of parts to it, but what would be the top maybe one or two components? Could be routine, support, some boundaries, as you pointed out, which would not compromise the efforts to provide autonomy to teachers and therefore the outcomes for students. So what would be those top maybe one or two or more important scaffolding elements that may be needed?
I think I'd put them in two buckets. One would be related to capabilities, and one would be related to community. I think in terms of capabilities, those kinds of scaffolds would be many of the things that you and Christine have also talked about. What are the things that are actually developing educators, whether those are professional learning experiences or coaching or mentoring or support, but also things like the quality of the curriculum and the materials that they're using as well. All of those things in terms of helping them actually not only feel more capable, but be more effective as a teacher. And then I think the second scaffolding would be related to community. Do they have colleagues? Are they operating in a culture of trust and a culture of support and a culture of learning? And I would personally add a culture of innovation that allows them to exercise that autonomy and take some risks and try some things and reflect together on what's working and what's not working.
That's really valuable insight, Jeff. I think we do look at these scaffolding elements from a program lens as we work through the education ecosystem. However, it's really useful to know the community aspect as well. There may be elements beyond maybe the observable institutional support that the ecosystem may be providing. And it's really important for us to be able to connect teachers to some of those elements that might not be observable, but maybe indirectly affecting their quality, teaching quality. So yeah, great. I think that's really useful answer, Jeff. Thank you so much. I will hand it back to Jane now.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Jobin, for that perspective again. We have heard clearly from Jeff's discussion that giving much freedom as much as possible can be problematic. Flexibility isn't just instruction, but it's about looking beyond that, looking at the strategies, the tools to get their teachers, giving the teachers an opportunity to create agency as much as possible. You can say that educators, and then I loved the two things that were coming out, where you're saying that you cannot just say educators in general. It's not general, but what context? Is it new educators or experienced educators that need to be supported? And how much flexibility can be given to a new educator and an experienced educator? So it goes back to how do we design in that role? I love, again, other discussion related to capabilities. What enhances the educator's capability? It's about the professional learning experiences, such as coaching, the quality of the curriculum, the community that promotes support, trust, and learning and innovation and adaptations. And this is heard very clearly from Jobin's experience. How does STAR education learn from this experience of evidence that peer learning networks are very important? Building connections is very important. Building relatedness is quite important, and connecting teachers. Therefore, it's very clear that autonomy sounds great until feedback gets lost into this translation. Is scaffolding that makes autonomy actually work? Jobin, we've had the data. It agrees that freedom without feedback is just chaos. Let's look at the chart. What questions are coming out from the chart? Ladies and gentlemen, I'd love to read the chart and see the questions that are coming out of the chart. I see, thanks for hosting this webinar. Motivation seems to be very enticing lever for policymakers and administrators. However, I wonder if your work, that school level motivation, can actually be diluted when rhetoric is coming from the top or from administrators. I also wonder if you've investigated motivation at other levels of the system. Many administrators are overworked and overwhelmed. What factors can assist in lightening the load and also giving them more pride and autonomy in their work? thinking of the middle tier. Over to you, our panelists. Can one of you be able to respond to that question?
I'm happy to say a word. I think it's a very important point, and we can look up and down the chain at the lack of feelings of autonomy, for example, at every level. And in some ways, I think that the lack of autonomy, let's say at the system level, can be part of what leads to a lack of feeling of empowerment at the school level, which can lead to a lack of feeling of empowerment at the teacher level, which can lead to a lack of agency at the student level as well. And so it's not a coincidence that we see students with less agency than they would ideally have, given what's happening up and down the chain. I think that, in our experience, one thing that can be very powerful is to use a process we call community-based design, where we actually bring people together from every level, students, teachers, administrators, or school leaders, system leaders, but also parents, and also community members, and also employers around a shared problem. And to say, we don't have to redesign everything, but here's a problem that affects all of us. Let's together investigate that problem. Let's together roll up our sleeves. Let's together ask, how might we try something? Let's try a small experiment. And that act of collective design itself can begin to shift mindsets about autonomy or the lack of autonomy. I remember one time we worked with people at the middle level of a system, at the district level, and we said to them, "What's really getting in your way from doing what you want?" And when they started to go through it, they realized there's actually less getting in my way than I needed to, but it was my own mindset that I didn't have autonomy that stopped me. And so when we flip it and we bring people together and say, there's a problem, let's try to solve it together, oftentimes the experience of actually being able to do something together itself can shift the perceptions and the realities of how much freedom or autonomy people have.
Absolutely beautiful. I love that mindset where you shift and the mindset and flip it and ask the community, how might we solve the problem together? How can we shift the design? How can we resolve this together with the community, with the system, with the parents, and everybody in the room? It's absolutely beautiful. Anybody else to comment on this question?
I can add just one thing. I think it's a really useful question because I think oftentimes we ask about teacher behavior and motivation if it's in isolation. Like, why aren't teachers doing this? But we often don't examine the rest of the system and how the different system actors' behavior impacts what teachers do in a classroom. So I don't think that we have a grand answer to this, but I think it's very important when you're thinking about what happens in a classroom is also what happens outside of the classroom when it comes to being able to motivate a teacher or get them to take a specific action or that. So I think it's a great question. And I think there's been a lot of research recently in the education development community around the middle tier, kind of recognizing the importance that they play. And I would encourage us not to just stop there, but like keep going up until you get to the very top of the system, because everyone's behavior impacts the person below them and across as well. So not an answer, but more of a comment.
Wow, absolutely great for us to think that what happens inside the classroom is what happens outside the classroom. Lack of autonomy at the system level is the same lack of autonomy at the school level, at the classroom level, and all this feeds into the system. So let's move on to another question. Too often we found autonomy to be a nice sounding way to say you are on your own. You've no support. Any suggested further reading or improving teacher autonomy? What does this mean? Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm looking for further comments. Please drop more questions in the chat so that it wasn't just a question, but just an agreement and a comment. Thank you so much. would love to move on to the next session. And this is the amazing part. Myth 3. A myth is lovely. Myth 3 is, if you want to know what motivates people, then you should ask them. Kate, as we move to myth 3, your research shows passion is real, but maybe not the whole story. After we ask people what motivates them, we would love to understand this myth. If you want to know what motivates people, then you should ask them. Kate, over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Jane, and everyone for having me, and the fellow panelists for the great talks earlier. So today I'm going to talk about why asking people what motivates them is simply not enough. And of course, as a behavioral scientist, I'm going to connect it a little bit, this question and the question about motivation to behavior, because that's ultimately what we're really interested in. So I think we've probably all been asked this before. What motivates you? And this question comes in many different forms. It could come in an interview or a feedback form where you might have been asked what motivates you or what would make things better for you. A teacher or a mentor might have asked you what gets in the way to put in the effort or what gets you to stay engaged. It could also come in the form of someone who you know really well in everyday life, who might be asked you why you keep doing what you're doing or what would make you change. And I think when we answer these questions and when you answer these questions, you probably in that moment gave an answer that felt true. Maybe you said something like you're motivated by impact, by growth, maybe by meaningful work. And this all really just brings me to today's myth, which is if you want to know what motivates people, just ask them. And I think this myth is kind of everywhere. And I guess my point that I'll make later is it's somewhat true, but somewhat false. So we use surveys, interviews, and focus group discussions to often ask people why they do what they do, what would motivate them more, and ultimately what would change their behavior. And when we ask these questions, we assume that their answers are accurate, and we often design programs around their answers and solutions around their answers. But psychology and behavioral science tells us that their answers aren't often the full picture. So why is this? Why aren't our answers to this question the full story? And there are definitely a number of reasons for this. I think Christine spoke about some around extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. I'm going to touch on two other ones today. The first is around something we call System 1 and System 2. And this is really around the fact that we oftentimes we assume that people have perfect self-knowledge. We think people know exactly what motivates them, and that if people are motivated, their behavior will naturally change. That's why we talk about motivation, right? Because we want people's behavior to change. But in practice, it doesn't really work like that. In real life, much of our behaviors and actually what motivates us happens without conscious thought. We don't stop carefully and analyze every decision we make. We often react to what feels easy, familiar, or even uncomfortable in that moment. So I'm sure many of you guys are familiar with Daniel Kahneman. He's a very famous behavioral scientist, and he explains this in what's known as dual processing theory. The idea that we have two systems that guide our thinking and our behavior. The first is System 1, which is really fast, automatic. It's more emotional. It responds to what feels easy, rewarding, or uncomfortable in that moment. And this is often what drives our habits and kind of immediate reactions to things. System 2 is more deliberate, slow, and reflective, and it's the part of us that thinks about our values, our goals, and our longer-term plans. So when someone asks a teacher what motivates them, their answer normally comes from System 2, the one that is reflective and deliberate. So they might say things like, I'm motivated by helping my students succeed. I care about improving learning, or I want to see my learners progress. And the teacher truly does mean what they say when they say this. But in the classroom, you might find their daily behavior is actually driven more by system one. So for example, a teacher may genuinely believe in a new teaching strategy they learned in a training. They could know it could lead to improved learning. And that's system two speaking. But if the strategy that they learned in that moment feels really complicated or time consuming or risky in front of the class, system one takes over. It prefers what feels familiar, what feels safe. So the teacher goes back to teaching the method that they're used to. And I want to make the point here, it's not that the teacher lacks motivation. It's that in that moment, the ease and habit win. So when we often ask teachers what motivates them, we're hearing from their long-term values from system two, but what shapes their behavior in the classroom is often what feels manageable or familiar and immediately workable through system one. And that gap is why simply asking people what motivates them doesn't tell us the full story about their motivation and practice and their subsequent behaviors that follow. And the second reason that I'm going to touch on is really around social desirability bias. So this is when we are asked about what motivates us, we often don't answer in a neutral way. We answer in a way that makes us look good to others and often to ourselves. We want to sound responsible, committed, and like the kind of person who cares about impact and quality. So we edit our answers and don't give ones that fully reflect what we actually think, feel, or do. So a teacher is unlikely to say, I stick to my old methods because they feel simple or safer to do. An employee won't say, I'm motivated by avoiding criticism, or a student won't say, I only study when there's a test tomorrow. Instead, we say things like, I care about student learning, I want to do my best, I'm passionate about improvement. And again, these statements aren't lies. People usually believe them, but they're often incomplete. And they really reflect how we want to see ourselves, not really what drives us day to day. So if we think about this all together, we kind of see the problem. We might ask people what motivates them. And when we do, we usually hear from their reflective side, the part of them that thinks about their values and their goals. And this is system two talking. And we also hear answers shaped by how they want to be seen, responsible, committed, capable. And people are kind of rarely aware of the gap between what they say and what their actual behavior is. So what I'm saying here is that when we rely on what people say about what motivates them, we're not getting bad data. We're just getting really incomplete data. We're often hearing ideals and not realities. So I think if you ask someone what motivates them, it's a useful starting point. But we need to think about designing for the what actually happens in reality, not really who people wish they were, but rather who they actually are. So I believe I'm probably over time, so I'm going to stop there and hand it back to Jobin.
Thank you so much, Kate. I think that's a really refreshing perspective to look at, because when even in our experience, when we look at measuring motivation, we usually end up as you're indicating, we might be ending up measuring what individuals respond from their system two, as defined by Daniel Kahneman. So I completely agree with you that in the classrooms, teachers may actually behave that feels more comfortable, familiar, and habits are sticky. So they're difficult to change. And even though their second system might know what exactly motivated behavior looks like, their system one might take over, on most days, if not all. So I completely resonate with that thought. And some of the efforts that we have taken in the past to get around this problem is, for example, through triangulation. So we do go ahead and anyway ask people if they're motivated or not, teachers, education officials, and we do observe them in their workplaces. But for example, in the study that Christin also mentioned, in which we worked with UNICEF, what we did was that we tried to bring together people in a room to talk about the motivation challenges or the outcomes, just to be able to triangulate. And what we try to isolate is also some of the biases that you also highlighted. For example, teachers might feel they might respond differently in front of their superiors, in the presence of their superiors, as against if you just go ahead and ask them in the company of only teachers. So we brought together teachers and head teachers separately, and we asked them what motivates them, what hinders motivation or teaching quality in the classrooms. And we asked the same question from educators in a separate room. So what we realized was that there is value in trying to get around these biases, because one of the key insights that came up was that motivation does matter. And to go back to your point, Kate, they did also highlight that there are other factors, primarily financial constraints and other operational factors that hinders their behavior in the classroom. So while they're clearly aware of what a motivated teacher looks like, what they need to do in order to motivate students to learn better, they are constrained by these host of other factors that Christine and Jeff also highlighted. So really that connects the dots well for us as well, Kate. And thank you so much for those insights. And one quick question that I want to maybe bounce just to get your thoughts is, I know it may not be a definitive response, but according to you, what may be some of the behavioral traits that we might look for? You highlighted that there could be a gap between motivation itself, so teachers may be motivated, so that may not be a problem, but what they do in the classrooms, their behavior, that may be different. And through the interventions that usually our ecosystem intervenes in, it tries to influence behavior more, as opposed to just the thought of motivation. So in that context, what could be one or two behavioral levers that you think might affect their behaviors, and not just their system too, of what they think?
Yeah, I realize we don't have much time and I could give a very long answer to this, so I'll just give a very practical short thing. I think making things as simple as possible. So in behavioral science, we often ask, does the individual have the capability to do what they need to do? Do they have the opportunity? And are they motivated? And I think we talk about motivation a lot, but the opportunity and capability, and I think Christine spoke a little bit on the capability side, but also like the opportunity is very important, and how we structure things is very important. Teachers are really busy. Everyone in the education system is really, really busy. How do we simplify? How do we make the instructions of something as simple as possible? How do we make the sequencing and process of something that they need to do, like regrouping students in a classroom to the right level, as simple as possible and efficient? Really basic things. So that's one thing. I think there's many others, but I saw that there are also some questions in the chat, so I don't want to go too far deep into this.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kate. I think that's a very simple but powerful response, and we take back from that learning. Thank you so much. Back to you, Kate. Jane.
Thank you very much, Kate and Jobin, on that sharing. From your experience, it shows very clearly that this myth is sometimes true or sometimes not true. Indeed, motivation is a complex thing. I love the two levels where she talked about human being systems, two systems that guide emotional behavior, the easy one, the slow and reflective and deliberate one. We have a question in the chat, and it goes to Kate, linked to my earlier question. Can Kate speak about or speak to the impact of peer pressure and social norms on parental behavior, re-supporting education? Is there any research on how big a factor this is, and what critical mass looks like in terms of shifting social norms to the extent they drive a ripple effect of behavior change? Also, is there any advice on practical ways to assess for motive if surveys alone are not reliable, or is it just a case?
Okay, great question. So I'll answer both and also one of the other ones. But social norms are very important, particularly around parents as well. So I did some work in my previous job at Ideas 42, where we looked at whether we could leverage social norms to get parents in Uganda to send their kids back to school. And there was just a simple message that was delivered when a survey was done in person, and it was something around like, did you know that 8 in 10 parents are sending their kids back to school after COVID? So it was normalizing the fact that people were sending their children back to school. And we tested this in an RCT, and it had statistically significant effects. I think it increased I don't remember the effect size, but it was quite big. That's just one example. I think there are many examples, but leveraging social norms is definitely important. I think there was also a question around the myth around their reply might be based on what is happening right now, their current circumstances, and what's motivating them and demotivating. 100%. In behavioral science, we call that availability bias. So you typically respond based on what happened recently and what you can recall. So that's another thing that affects what motivates people. And I think the question around, if we can't rely on surveys and other tools, what do you do to understand motivation? I think you should still use those because sometimes they are the best and only way that you can get some of this information. But I really encourage people to go and sit in on the classroom or whatever actor it is to observe their context and their circumstances. And that will help you uncover maybe some of the why to their responses to motivation. And then to have, I always love the qualitative interviews where you don't ask what motivates them, but you ask you try to figure out what in their environment is preventing them from taking the action that you want them to take. Not by asking them that, but just asking broader questions around their circumstances, the context. You can ask questions about how they feel and what they perceive motivates them, but I think you need to triangulate that with other types of research as well. So I think that's why I said my myth is somewhat true and somewhat false. Like, I think it's just not the full story around motivation. But if it's the only means that you have to get some information, a little bit is better than none. But know that if you only design for that, it's probably not the full reality of the person's context.
Thank you very much, Kate. I absolutely agree. You don't ask what motivates them, but try to observe what is it in their environment that gets them motivated. Thank you so much. Maybe before I close and hand over to Resi, we want to give this opportunity to Resi to close this webinar in a wonderful way. Over to you, Resi.
Thanks a lot, Jane. Thanks a lot, everyone. I think as we close, just 2 minutes for me to just share my thoughts. Like, I'm holding the 3 ideas from today. I think from Christine, the reminder that monetary incentives are just part of the story, but only one part of a much longer list. And from Jeff, I think the idea that autonomy matters, but it needs clear shared goals and the right calibration of support or scaffolding that Jobin talks about. And then from Kate, I think that line I will keep borrowing. These myths contain so much that is true and so much that is false. So we can't just ask people what motivates them and assume that answers tells the full story. So I think that feels like the honest place to land for everyone here. So motivation is rarely either or. It's layered, it's contextual, and I think it's shaped by the circumstances that we are all in. So again, thank you so much for everyone for spending your time with us today. Thanks for all the panelists. I've learned a lot and I've taken so much insights from all of you. And just a couple quick things for everyone here. The first one is the feedback form. So we'd love to hear your thoughts. So please take a minute to fill in the feedback form using the link in the chat. And then the next one is that if today's discussion sparked ideas about exploring these motivational mechanisms in your own organization, we'd be delighted to continue the conversation. And feel free to reach out to Mark from STIR using the contact details in the email that will follow this webinar. So thanks a lot, everyone, for today and being part of today's conversation.